Her words took me by surprise, and I found myself nodding in agreement. Even if I hurriedly said I wasn't looking, it was already too late. Moreover, she went on to say something absolutely astonishing. At first, I was like, what is she talking about? But her words concealed a gentle sentiment. Those words became the turning point, and both our lives changed dramatically after that. My name is Jake, 23 years old. After college, I failed to get a proper job and ended up working part-time at a resort hotel. Well, I guess I'm what you'd call a part-time worker. The reason I chose the resort hotel goes back to an event during college. When I was in my junior year, my beloved grandmother, who always doted on me, passed away. Though I lived in New York and my grandmother near a resort area in upstate New York, we didn't see each other often, but we stayed in touch regularly. I loved her deeply, knowing how much she cherished me. After her passing, her home remained untouched for a while. Around the time I was graduating college, discussions arose about whether to sell or rent out her home. That's when I took it over. This was mainly because, after failing in my job hunting, I felt a bit alienated by my parents and friends, as if I were damaged goods. I didn't really want to stay in New York anymore. I figured, if I'm going to work as a part-time worker, it didn't matter if I stayed in the city or near the resort where my grandmother lived. So, I moved to my grandmother's house, almost as if running away from the city. Not far from my grandmother's, within biking distance, there was this big resort hotel, so I decided to work there. One early morning during my shift at the resort, I spotted a woman walking by the poolside before it was open to guests. "Excuse me, the pool isn't open yet." When I spoke up, the woman smiled warmly and asked, "Are you one of the part-timers?" Turning to face me, she was a strikingly beautiful woman with distinct mole under her eyes. I was taken aback by her long, pale legs extending from her skirt, trying my best not to show my surprise. "Yes, I just started this spring." Hearing this, she smiled and said, "Oh, I see," and extended her right hand towards me. "My name is Alyssa Smith. I'm the only daughter of the owner here. Technically, I'm an employee, so being here is allowed, okay?" I have heard her name before, and the story of the beautiful 25-year-old soul heiress was pretty well known. Yet, she worked at the hotel. My main job was cleaning the pool and recreational facilities, so we hadn't crossed paths before. "Oh, I'm so sorry, my bad." "It's fine. I haven't been to the poolside in a while either." From then on, Alyssa and I started chatting more often. It seemed Alyssa went to local college and only visited New York on trips. I casually mentioned that I moved from New York, which seemed to pique her interest. Alyssa was very friendly and easygoing. About a month after we met, when I was still addressing her as Ms. Smith, she corrected me saying, "You know the hotel CEO is also named Smith, right? Isn't it a bit confusing? Just call me Alyssa. We're around the same age and friends now, so there's no need for formalities, okay?" It felt a bit bold to drop the formalities, but now, 3 months since we met, I call her Alyssa. Ever since Alyssa and I got acquainted, she began showing up more frequently at the poolside. Always with a bright smile, seeing her would energize me to get for my workday. However, on a day in early July, Alyssa came by the pool, but her usual cheerful expression was nowhere to be seen. I was just about to take a break, so I guided Alyssa to the break area and offered her some cold drink. Even as she sat on the sofa, her face remained downcast. Wondering what had upset her, she finally broke the silence. "Can you help me convince my family?" "Huh? Convince? About what?" I was baffled, and seeing my confusion, Alyssa quickly added, "Oh, I'm sorry, I should have been clearer. I'm facing a dilemma and could really use some advice. It's for the sake of my family." As she shared her story, it turned out that Alyssa's grandmother had fallen ill. She had been battling the illness for a long time, and recently, The doctors had hinted that she might not have much longer. Her grandmother's dying wish was to meet Alyssa's future husband. But Alyssa isn't currently dating anyone. Thus, her parents had arranged a matchmaking date for her. However, according to Alyssa, she absolutely can't stand the guy they've set her up with. The thing is, that guy used to bully me when we were kids. I don't even want to see him again. Well, I've heard that those who've been bullied never forget, so it's not surprising. Why not tell your parents the truth about it? I tried, but they just brushed it off, saying it was just childhood stuff. I later suggested that she could go on the date and then gently decline, but Alyssa immediately dismissed that idea, not even wanting to see the guy's face. But Alyssa's parents had said, if Alyssa has a boyfriend, of course, we won't set up the matchmaking date. But you don't, do you? So why not just give it a shot? We want to see Grandma happy, and we're worried about your future. What do you think I should do? I understand my parents' concern for their unmarried daughter, and of course, I want to make Grandma happy. That's why I'm so lost about what to do. I pondered for a while. Convincing her parents seemed the right move, but if they aren't willing to listen, a bold move might be necessary. What about asking someone to pretend to be your boyfriend? Your parents did say if you had a boyfriend, they wouldn't arrange the date. At first, Alyssa stared blankly, but a few seconds later, her eyes were sparkling. That's it. And suddenly, she started taking off her clothes. Whoa, hold on, Alyssa. What are you doing? Seeing my panicked reaction, Alyssa burst into laughter. Silly, I'm wearing a swimsuit underneath. I'm so happy I feel like taking a slide. Amped up, Alyssa headed straight for the pool and swiftly went down the water slide. Her expressive enthusiasm was overwhelming, but even more distracting was the sight of her stunning bikini-clad figure. Then, with a big splash, Alyssa came down from the water slide into the pool below. But then, a little mishap occurred. Her bikini had shifted slightly out of place. It wasn't fully exposed, but instinctively, I covered my eyes with my hands. Seeing this, Alyssa casually remarked, "Oops," and quickly adjusted her bikini. As she approached the poolside, a thought seemed to strike her, and she looked over at me with a bright expression. With a sly smile, she asked, "Did you get a peek?" Recalling the earlier sight, I inadvertently replied, "Yes," but I quickly came to my senses. After all, I didn't actually see everything. No, I didn't see anything. I swear, I didn't see a thing. Amused by my flustered state, Alyssa pointed at me and firmly said, "Nope, you saw it. So now, you're going to play the role of my boyfriend." Of course, I tried coming up with several excuses to decline the boyfriend role, but Alyssa's decision was final. And then, 5 days later, I found myself introducing myself to Alyssa's parents as her boyfriend. Turns out, Alyssa's dad is the CEO of the company where I work part-time. Being just a part-timer, I had never met the CEO before. I was nervous, wondering what kind of person he'd be, but contrary to my imagination, Alyssa's dad was about 100 times more easygoing and cheerful. Alyssa's mom was a fantastic cook and had a gentle demeanor. Both were surprised that Alyssa was dating a part-timer like me, but these kind-hearted folks accepted me warmly without realizing I was a fake boyfriend. It seems they called off the matchmaking date. I had no idea she was dating a guy from our company. She's quite a handful. Well, please take care of her," her father said, shaking my hand with a firm grip. Her mother served her home-cooked meals, and although I was full, she kept saying, eat up," encouraging me to have more. Anyway, they were truly wonderful people. And I also met Alyssa's grandmother, who I heard was sick. Lately, she seemed to be feeling better, showing a more lively smile than expected, which was a relief for Alyssa. Alyssa's grandmother gently took my hand and caressed it. "Are you Alyssa's fiancé?" "Well, not exactly a fiancé, Given that I was just pretending to be her boyfriend, I was quite puzzled, but Alyssa came to my rescue. "Grandma, he's not a fiancé, he's my boyfriend." Alyssa's grandmother chuckled and nodded. Right, I forgot. It's great to meet you. Thank you for coming. And your name is?" "It's Jake." Upon hearing my name, her grandmother looked surprised and said, "Oh, are you from around here? I used to live in New York, but now I live in my grandmother's house, which is near a resort hotel." She listened with interest to my story. Could it be the house with the large cherry tree in the garden? I was taken aback by her words. It was true that there was a cherry tree in the garden. Considering it's a small town, maybe she knew my grandmother. I wanted to ask her about it, but before I could, Alyssa and her parents called me over. I didn't think it was a big deal, so I didn't pursue the topic further. After that, I had a pleasant time chatting with Alyssa's family. And just as I was about to leave, Alyssa's grandmother whispered something in my ear. You're not a real boyfriend, are you?" "What?" I was completely taken aback, realizing that our fake boyfriend plan had been exposed. "Haha, I can tell. Is it the wisdom of age or something? The way you and Alyssa interact, it seems a bit off. Did Alyssa ask you to do this for me and her parents?" "Well, yes." I foolishly nodded in agreement, but the grandmother was still smiling warmly at me. "I'm sorry for putting you in such a situation, but Alyssa is a really sweet girl. Please continue to be her friend, and I'm glad I got to meet you too." "Thank you, I'm sorry." It seemed that the grandmother had figured out that Alyssa had set up the fake boyfriend plan out of kindness. She didn't blame either of us. Afterwards, the grandmother told me to keep it a secret from Alyssa that she had figured it out, so I did. Though we managed to avoid the matchmaking meeting successfully, a few days later, during my day off, I received an unexpected call from Alyssa. My grandmother's condition has worsened, and she's been rushed to the hospital. I got a call from home. What should I do? I can't bear the thought if something happens to her. I had never heard Alyssa sound so panicked and on the verge of tears. "Calm down. Where are you now? I'll get a cab and come pick you up. Then we'll go to the hospital together." I couldn't let her go to the hospital alone in such a state, so I hailed a taxi. After picking up Alyssa, we hurried to the hospital where our grandmother had been taken. In the taxi, Alyssa, who seemed to have been holding back, started to break down and shed tears. She was so lively before. "It's not going to be our last goodbye today, is it? I'm scared. What do we do?" Alyssa's hands, resting on her lap, clenched tightly. I placed my hand over Alyssa's, trying to reassure her. "Everything will be all right. Plus, I'm here with you. You're not alone. It'll be okay." Throughout our drive to the hospital, I kept speaking comforting words to Alyssa. Once we arrived at the hospital, we couldn't see the grandmother right away. Throughout the day, the grandmother's condition didn't improve, and our days were filled with anxiety. During that time, I stayed close to Alyssa as much as possible. "Hey, Jake, I'm sorry for keeping you with me all the time. You must be tired, right? I think I can manage on my own now." Alyssa's face betrayed her attempt to be brave, showing her underlying fear. To begin with, I was happy that Alyssa rallied on me when her grandmother was taken to the hospital. If being by her side could ease Alyssa's worries even a little, I wanted to be there for her. "It's okay. I'm concerned about your grandmother and about you. I want to be here." With those words, I stayed by Alyssa's side. 3 days after the hospitalization, the grandmother's condition finally stabilized, and we were allowed to visit. Right after the visit, the grandmother looked frail, which made me anxious. However, as the days passed, she began to recover, and by the end of 2 weeks, she had regained her cheerful smile. The doctor told us that the worst was over, and the likelihood of her condition worsening abruptly was low. One day, during our visit, the grandmother looked at Alyssa and me, and gave us a mischievous smile. Then she said, "You too. Things are going well, huh? At that, both Alyssa and I blushed. In fact, since Alyssa's grandmother was hospitalized, I realized I wanted to be there for Alyssa, to support and protect her. So after hearing from the doctor that her grandmother's condition had stabilized, I confessed my feelings to Alyssa. It turned out Alyssa felt the same way about me, and we had just started dating a few days ago. It seems there's no keeping secrets from the old lady. Haha, you two make a lovely pair. Instead of just being a boyfriend, I'd love for you to be my grandson-in-law soon. Besides, if you're Terry's grandson, I'm sure you'd make Alyssa happy. Hearing that, I was taken aback. I remembered the sound of the name Terry. A few of my grandmother Theris's friends had referred to her as Terry during her funeral. Alyssa seemed just as surprised. Who's Terry? Jake's grandmother. Wait, do you know Jake's grandmother? Alyssa's grandmother nodded emphatically. Of course I do. As the story went, my grandmother Theresa and Alyssa's grandmother had been childhood friends. Both were born and raised in the same small town in Nebraska and later married there. Even in their golden years, they frequently met up for coffee and chats. Alyssa's grandmother often heard stories from my grandmother about her adorable grandson. Embarrassingly, my grandmother would tell Alyssa's grandmother things like, "My grandson wouldn't hurt a fly, and he sends me flowers on my birthday. Isn't he sweet?" Hearing those stories, I remembered my beloved grandmother Theresa's gentle smile. Unfortunately, during my grandmother's funeral, Alyssa's grandmother had been unwell. So she had never met me. We used to joke that it would be nice if our grandchildren got married someday. It's like a dream come true for me and Terry. Thanks to you too, she chuckled. We exchanged a glance and shared a laugh. Neither of us had known that our grandmothers were childhood friends, but we both realized that we had been recipients of their love, which warmed our hearts. Some time later, Alyssa's grandmother passed away. It was a sad time, but in her last moments, she wore a contented smile, surrounded by her family. I felt blessed to have been accepted as part of the family to bid her farewell. I then started working full-time at Alyssa's father's resort, having started out as a part-timer. Being seen as a potential future son-in-law, I've been put through the ringer every day. Watching me push myself to the limit, Alyssa always greets me with a bright smile. "You used to just coast through when you were part-timing, remember? Now, your expression is completely different. It makes me so happy thinking you're doing all this for our future together." Hearing her say that, I feel like she's become even more radiant lately. That's another reason I'm so driven in my job. I want to become a man worthy of standing by her side. Once I feel I've truly come into my own, I plan to propose to Alyssa and get married. When that day comes, Alyssa and I intend to visit the graves of our grandmothers and give them our heartfelt update. I'm sure both of them would be overjoyed about our marriage. So, how did you find today's story? Your subscription and a thumbs up would be a great encouragement for our content creation. We're looking forward to your comments as well. See you in the next video. It's my first time taking a trip to a hot spring with a man. I feel a bit uneasy, but you need to entertain me. The boss, who usually dumps all the work on me and constantly complains, is now smiling at me. My boss smiles at me, but it feels like a stranger. She is acting like we're meeting for the first time. I'm not used to going on trips to hot spring with a woman, but I'll do my best to make it enjoyable for you. Saying that, my face turned red. Why did I end up coming on this hot spring trip with my boss? There was a particular reason I was unaware of until today. My name is Mike. I'm 24 and work in the kitchen of a major food chain. My dad ran a sushi bar for many years. However, a few years before I was about to graduate from culinary school, my dad collapsed from overworking, He had to take a long break for recovery, and he ended up closing the sushi bar he had run for years. I'll take over Dad's business once I graduate from culinary school. I got my chef's license in college and want to train in your restaurant. I wanted to continue the business my dad built, so I begged him. But my dad disagreed. I can't trust you with my business when you have no work experience. Get a job elsewhere first and learn how to behave professionally. Working in a family business can lead to taking things for granted. Realizing the naivety of my thoughts after what my dad said, I acknowledged my mistake. But I had earned my chef's license in culinary school with the goal of becoming a chef like my dad. When my dad refused to let me take over, I felt lost about what kind of job I really wanted. A friend from culinary school told me, "You know the restaurant we always go to. They're hiring and have amazing pay and training programs. They have many locations, and you can choose one close to home." My friend introduced me to the job listing of the major food chain, which is where I currently work. The pay is indeed much better than other job offers, and they even offer training programs abroad. Impressed with the unexpected benefits, I took the interview and was hired. It's been 3 years since I joined as a fresh graduate. I've been working hard to support my parents. However, there was one major problem at work. That was the bad relationship with my immediate boss. My boss, Arya, is the precious only daughter of the company's CEO. She's very strict at work, always pushing tasks onto me and constantly nitpicking. What's with this presentation? It's nothing like the picture. Customers will complain about this misleading photo. What's with this salty pasta? Did you mess up the seasoning? This is toxic. She would then throw away the dish I prepared. Yet, she never does any cooking herself and only chats with regular customers. I'm busy with customer service, so I'll leave all the cooking to you. She would leave all the kitchen tasks to me. Being alone and trying to prepare dishes for many customers at once can get overwhelming. My boss would come unexpectedly to check for even the smallest mistakes. Not just me, she would do the same with newcomers who had only been with the company for a few months. As a result, I've seen about 15 chefs resign in the past 3 years. If it wasn't for such a bossy manager, we wouldn't be struggling with staff shortages. I strongly disliked my boss, who was unreasonable and always complaining. On top of that, I couldn't stand the worsening staff shortage because of her. I have to prepare dishes for 20 customers all by myself. Her delegation of tasks is seriously messed up. Thankfully, I live with my parents, so I have them to vent my frustrations to. When the stress and fatigue from work build up, I would vent to my parents and they would listen. My dad would silently nod while my mom would say, "That sounds tough." But I noticed a complex look on their faces whenever they listened to my complaints, a mix of concern and sadness. Maybe they're tired of my constant complaints. Did I get carried away? I noticed the look on my parents' faces and reflected on my actions. I started to hold back on my complaints to them. A few months passed, and then my birthday came. "Thanks for always working hard. Every once in a while, you should take some time off," my mom said, handing me a spa voucher. "But only for one person. Aren't we going as a family?" I was surprised, but my mom, with a hesitant look on her face, said, "Ever since your dad collapsed, he hasn't been eating much, right? It's risky for him to go to a hot spring because he might faint." Indeed, since my dad collapsed from exhaustion a few years back, he had lost a lot of weight from not eating much. His blood pressure and pulse weren't stable, and he was under the care of his primary doctor for his arrhythmia. Taking him on a spa trip would indeed be risky. I mean, we don't have to go to a hot spring. Aren't these things supposed to be for the whole family? I had a slight complaint towards my mom, but considering my dad's condition, I couldn't voice it. "Well, maybe going alone once in a while isn't a bad idea, thanks," I'll enjoy it. I smiled at my mom, who looked relieved and said, I'm glad you liked it. The following month, during the long weekend, I went to the spa alone with the voucher my mom had given me. As soon as I arrived at the spa hotel, there was a woman arguing with the receptionist in the lobby. There's no way my reservation isn't in. Isn't this a mistake on your part? Please check properly. I recognized the assertive voice of the woman. It was the same voice of my boss I hear at work. Arya, what are you doing here? I was surprised to see my boss, but she approached me aggressively. I was supposed to meet my parents here, but there's no reservation under their name. Why are you here? My boss seemed quite furious and lashed out at me. Calm down, I said, handing my voucher to the receptionist. We've been expecting you, sir. You have a reservation in the same room with this lady. The receptionist, with a relieved expression, handed me a key to a room. Wait a minute, I came alone. I'd like separate rooms, please. I hastily conveyed this, but the receptionist showed me the reservation form and said, but you clearly reserved a shared room. My boss, who had been assertive a little while ago, looked as if she was about to panic. I decided to head to our room and discuss the situation further with my boss. As soon as we entered the room, she called the CEO. Dad, what's going on? I wasn't told I'd be sharing a room with a subordinate. She seemed upset with the CEO for a while, but after hearing some explanation, she looked dejected. So that's what it was. You could have told me directly. Then she got off the phone with the CEO. And the boss, looking downcast, explained the situation to me. Actually, for a while now, Mike had mentioned that he would invite his childhood friend, a sushi chef, to add sushi and sashimi to our restaurant's special menu. She struggled to find her words. I didn't understand what he meant when he said, "Don't be too hard on your subordinate. He's an important business partner and you're betrothed." Now I finally get it. I can't believe I'm engaged to you. I calmly responded. I hadn't heard about you being my fiancé either, but my dad is indeed a sushi chef. There was an awkward silence between us. Unable to bear it any longer, I called my dad. Hello, Dad, what's this about sharing a room with my boss? Please explain. I asked in a voice close to tears, and my dad chuckled and replied. I knew you two weren't getting along. I couldn't bring myself to tell you she's your fiancé. Is it true about the engagement? I was taken aback, and my dad proudly explained. Her dad and I have been friends since childhood. It's hard for me to work alone, so he's helping expand my sushi and sashimi dishes to his restaurant chain. As I was lost for words, he continued with enthusiasm. Choosing to work at your fiancé's company without me telling you is remarkable. Isn't it destiny? You and Arya were close in preschool. If you two are arguing at work, just reconcile. He hung up after leaving me with those words. I tried to recall the distant past, feeling bewildered. Come to think of it, I think I had a girlfriend back in preschool. Our parents were close friends from way back. Did they promise to set us up as childhood sweethearts? I can hardly remember, as I was so young. Then, why haven't we met since preschool? I was asked this by my boss, and it made me reminisce about the past. That's right. Around the time I started elementary school, my dad's restaurant started struggling. He had to take on some debt for a while. Then, my boss suddenly looked up, surprised. I remember that my dad's restaurant also faced troubles when I was in elementary school. Him copying another store's menu became a big problem. We both looked at each other and burst out laughing. So we both got busy helping our family businesses and just grew up without seeing each other. My dad, even being a businessman, has always been a bit clumsy with things like that. He could have just told me what was going on. We both laughed at how our parents handled things. It's my first time on a hot springs trip with a man. I'm a bit nervous. Will you make it enjoyable for me? Usually, she dumps all the work on me and complains, but now my boss was smiling at me. She looked like a complete stranger, not the boss I knew. Blushing and fidgeting, looking incredibly adorable. I'm not used to going on trips to a hot spring with a lady, but I'll do my best to make it enjoyable. We decided to make the most of our unexpected hot springs trip. Seeing her private, cute, and clingy side made me nervous. And I was taken aback by her appearance in her robe. I couldn't tell just from working with her, but she had a slim figure with large breasts. She looked incredibly beautiful. Her unexpected sides kept making my heart race. Returning home from the trip, our fathers were arguing. It can't be helped. The kids just don't get along. I waited 3 years for my son to get used to his job, but they just aren't getting close. You should have explained the situation before sending them on a trip. What if that made their relationship worse? You sent your daughter to, without explaining, right? It's the same. Seeing me, my dad said. How was it? Did you enjoy the hot springs? Sorry, Mike, for sending you without any explanation. Ara's dad was like, I'll make sure to tell my daughter properly, so it's okay to let the two of them go to a spa, you know. My dad looked at the CEO, who awkwardly said, I wanted to tell my daughter about the arranged marriage, but couldn't bring myself to do it when she was right there. In the end, neither father could explain to us, and the day of the hot springs trip just arrived. Mike, I'm sorry. I knew you two didn't get along, but I wanted our families to be close again. Plus, I wanted our businesses to prosper by joining forces. Being apologized to by the CEO made me feel uneasy. It's fine. It was unexpected, but I had a good time. As I said that, my boss stepped forward. You guys have such a clumsy way of communicating. Important things should be explained to the person directly involved, right? I'm sorry for being so awkward. The CEO bowed his head, and my boss blushed and said, well, it's okay. The setup was messy, but it was nice to have a heart-to-heart conversation with my subordinate. So, usually when you dump work on me and nag, it's just because you care about me, right? They say we tend to tease the ones we like. Before I could finish, she covered my mouth and said, idiot, I told you to keep what we talked about in the hot springs a secret. Seeing us, our fathers felt relieved. Who would have thought my fiancé would be in the company I joined? How would college me react if he knew about this through time travel? But the biggest surprise was finding out that my boss, whom I thought disliked me, actually had feelings for me. If we hadn't gone on that hot springs trip, I might have never understood your feelings. I said, and she replied with a teasing smile. And I might have never confessed my feelings to you. We laughed, now dating as a couple. She's still strict at work, sometimes unreasonable, and dumps a lot of work on me. But if all that is out of love, I feel like I can handle anything. I wonder if after we get married, will you still be strict about the cooking? I muttered, and she replied with a stern face, did you say something? We're at work now, you know. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. I responded with enthusiasm and am hard at work today as well. Even during work, I daydream about marrying her and can't help but grin to myself, but that's a secret from her. Well, she might actually have a hunch that I'm thinking of proposing. So, what did you think? Subscribing to the channel would really boost my motivation. See you in the next video. My name's Tom. Recently, I got married to someone very special to me. But it wasn't a smooth journey to get to this point. I'm planning to share the story of my wife and me in chronological order. My wife and I were both hired at the same company. Both are the same age, having both joined the company as college graduates. My wife's name is Margaret. Back then, we were just colleagues, and I used to casually call her Margaret. After our orientation, we ended up in the same department. We were both in sales, encouraging each other to do our best, grinding day in and day out. At the time, I had a girlfriend. We were getting along pretty well, I'd say. Then, in late April, I got a call from my buddy Joe. Joe is an old high school buddy of mine. We went to different college but would occasionally hang out, just the guys. I got a call from Joe saying, "I got some couple tickets for an amusement park. Want to bring our girlfriends?" I'd never been on a double date before, so it was a bit awkward, but it seemed like it could make a good memory. My girlfriend was also up for it, so we decided to go. On the day of our double date during the long weekend, we met up at the location. I got out of my car and shouted, "Hey, Joe." Joe raised his hand. "Hey, long time no see." We both knew that we had girlfriends, but we'd never actually met them or even heard their names before. Feeling a bit jittery, we introduced our girls. "This is Margaret. Nice to meet ya." The moment I saw the face of the girl stepping out of Joe's car, I said, "What, Margaret? Tom, is that you?" We both looked at each other and couldn't help but laugh. Turns out, my buddy Joe's girlfriend was none other than my co-worker Margaret. "No way. I knew you were in sales, but Tom and Margaret, you're at the same company." Joe was equally shocked and raised his voice. It was such a coincidence, all we could do was laugh. Riding that wave of laughter, we all acted like kids running around an amusement park. Then at lunchtime, they said they had something to tell me. Joe and Margaret were planning to get married in June. The wedding date was still up in the air, but they said once they'd saved up some cash, they'd like to have a wedding. So, come a lucky day in June, Joe and Margaret tied the knot. Margaret kept her last name. I hear that ever since they got married, Margaret's been making Joe's lunch every day. I was privy to all these lovey-dovey stories. But as for me, I got dumped by my girlfriend that fall. Ever since she heard Joe and Margaret were getting married, she'd been mulling over our future. I'd been thinking about it too, but what she said hit me hard. "I can't see a future with you." I asked if I'd done something wrong, but her response was vague, something like, "It just doesn't feel right." Let the past be the past, I thought, but it was a tough pill to swallow. Joe and Margaret were the ones who consoled and encouraged me. Despite being newlyweds, they'd invite me over and lift my spirits with some drinks. Best friends and co-workers, including myself. The three of us started hanging out more once Joe and Margaret got married. I thought this enjoyable dynamic would last forever. Then a new year rolled around, and spring came along. It was the spring marking our second year at the company. One Monday, when work hours had already started, Margaret was nowhere to be found. "Is she unusually off work today?" Just as I was about to ask my boss that, my phone rang. It was an old high school buddy. "Sorry to bother you at work, but I just got a call from a friend." Without any pleasantries, he sounded rushed. But the next words from him left me in shock. Joe had an accident. It was a call to tell me that Joe had passed away this morning. "What, Joe? You're kidding me. What do you mean he's gone?" I was rattled. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The accident happened last night. Joe was in the passenger seat of a friend's car, and an oncoming car, apparently a dozing driver, ran into the car Joe was in. He was rushed into emergency surgery but passed away in the early hours. I attended Joe's funeral. "Joe, why did it have to be you?" I couldn't stop the tears. The harsh reality was too much to take. Margaret held it together at first but broke down crying during the service. I couldn't bear to look at her like that, so I covered my face with a handkerchief, trying to stifle my sobs. Afterwards, Margaret took a month off work. By the time she came back, she had lost a lot of weight. When she returned, she came to my desk. "Tom, thanks for all the emails. Sorry for worrying you." Margaret smiled, but I could tell she was still forcing it. "Even I can't believe that Joe's gone. That's why I've been so worried about Margaret." During her time off, I have been sending her emails at night. Are you eating properly? Getting good sleep in your bed? That's all I could really ask in my emails. But Margaret told me she appreciated those messages. Being alone at night was tough for her. When she got home, the loneliness hit her hard, and she couldn't get anything down. When she got an email from me, it made her think that she had to at least try to live a normal life. Even if it was just one sandwich, she managed to eat it. Seeing Margaret like that, I couldn't bring myself to say, "I hope you get better soon." All I could do to make her feel even a little bit better was to invite her out for dinner after work. I've tried a couple of times with colleagues who are also worried about her, but she declined, saying she's not up for it yet. But we kept asking her. And eventually, she accepted our invitation. Her appetite was small, but seeing Margaret say the food was good and actually eating a little made me feel somewhat relieved. On our way back from dinner, as we live in the same direction, Margaret and I walked down the night streets together. Then Margaret started talking about Joe. He is in the cemetery now, and all that's left at home is his portrait. I'm really alone now. Margaret started to cry, her tears flowing freely. All I could do for her was offer her my handkerchief and rub her back. Her sorrow from losing Joe is beyond my own. With that thought, I found myself at a loss for words. I'm sorry, thank you. Margaret had been crying for a while, but she said that and started walking again. I had initially planned to only walk her part of the way home, but I couldn't bear to let her walk alone in her current state, so I ended up walking her all the way to her house. There, I lit a candle in memory of Joe. Pictures from the funeral, along with cheerful photos of Margaret and Joe, adorned the room. Seeing that, I couldn't hold back my tears either. I'm sorry for crying when I should be the one encouraging you. My words got choked up in tears. It's too soon, isn't it? We had so much more ahead of us. It's frustrating, but I bet Joe is the most frustrated of all. Margaret said that as she wiped away her tears. But I have to keep going, or else Joe would worry, she shared. Even though she might not be fully ready yet, she's trying to cheer up a little bit at a time. I wondered what I could do for Margaret. All I can do is listen to her and take her out to eat. That felt so inadequate. Margaret had said that she finds it easier to cope while working, but it seemed like she was putting on a brave face. Yet, she managed to get through the first anniversary of Joe's passing, and while she still had her down moments, Margaret was slowly getting her spirits back. During this time, the support from everyone remained unchanged. A few of us from work kept inviting her out to dinner after work. I continued to walk Margaret back to her house. On days when we got home early, I would light a candle in memory of Joe. One day while I was walking Margaret back to her house, she asked, "Why do you always walk me home? I don't want you to be in danger if something happens on the way home, right? There are dark streets. Besides, if something happened to Margaret, Joe would be furious. I don't care if it's none of my business, but I have to protect you, whom Joe cherished so much. Otherwise, he's going to get mad at me in my dreams about what I'm doing." I say all this with a bit of a chuckle to lighten the mood. Margaret said thanks and she laughed along. Time passed, and we reached the third anniversary of Joe's passing. Both Margaret and I were more involved in our work than ever. On exhausting days, we continued to unwind by going out to dinner with some coworkers. Then one day, as I was walking Margaret home again, she said she had a small favor to ask. "You see, the light bulbs in my foyer and dressing room have gone out. I tried standing on a step stool, but I just can't reach. Could you help?" To Margaret, who seemed a bit embarrassed to ask, I cheerfully replied, "Sure thing, no big deal. Don't sweat the small stuff," I added, and Margaret smiled as if she were really pleased. Once inside her house, I replaced the light bulbs for her. "Thanks so much. It's surprising how much you need a tall person sometimes," she said. I joked, "Well, Good thing I could reach the ceiling. Otherwise, that would have been embarrassing. Huh? Margaret laughed and said, "Funny thing is, when Joe changed a light bulb in another room, he was barely reaching it, trembling all the while." I laughed back. "Ha, well, I'm way taller than him. Yeah, this ceiling would be a stretch for Joe." Margaret suddenly burst out laughing. I stepped down from the step stool, folded it up, and handed it over to her. But just then, our fingers lightly touched, and our eyes met unexpectedly. The laughter that filled the air between us abruptly ceased. However, I looked away as if I felt nothing. That's when Margaret softly said, "Hey, why are you so kind?" Hearing that, our eyes met again. For a split second, I felt my heart skip a beat, but I said nothing and just looked at Margaret. "You're always encouraging me, and you're always concerned. You're too kind. I might get the wrong idea." Margaret spoke slowly, and once again, I felt my heart flutter. But then she said, "Just kidding. Sorry, forget it. Geez, maybe I'm a little tipsy today," and went on to put away the step stool as if nothing had happened. However, I found myself chasing after her, and before I knew it, I was hugging her from behind. A moment of silence passed. I could feel the warmth radiating from Margaret from my arms. And then it hit me. The feeling that I wanted to protect Margaret was there, and it wasn't just as a co-worker or as a friend's wife. I was falling for Margaret. But the moment I realized this, my buddy Joe's face flashed through my mind. So I loosened my arms that were wrapped around her. "Sorry, I may be a little tipsy too." I apologized to Margaret. Margaret shook her head, saying no, and turned towards me. A tear was visible in her eye. I lifted my gaze slightly, and it landed on Joe's framed photo. Without a word, I walked up to the photo and lit a candle. In my heart, I whispered, "Sorry, Joe," unable to say anything else. Then I told Margaret, "See you at work tomorrow," and left her house. The next day at the office, Margaret and I acted as if nothing had happened. But from that day on, every time our eyes met, it felt as if we were swallowing something. I suspected Margaret felt the same way. These days continued for a while. And then one day, while I was walking Margaret home after having dinner with coworkers, an unusual silence filled the air. The words we'd been holding back since that moment had been gradually growing stronger. I stopped walking. Margaret noticed and stopped too. Then, I finally told Margaret how I felt. "Is it so bad if it's me? I want to be by your side, in any way possible." That was my true, sincere feeling. Margaret looked at me and after a moment of silence, nodded, yes. She had accepted my feelings. But it wasn't the end. On my day off that week, I went to a certain place. I stood in front of Joe's grave. This was important news. I wanted to say it here, where Joe was. "Joe, I've come to make a resolution. I'll make Margaret happy, and I'll take good care of her on your behalf too. So please, accept that I'll be the one with her. I promise, I'll protect her smile no matter what." I said that, then bowed my head in front of Joe's grave. How long I closed my eyes and bowed, I can't say. Suddenly, I felt a gentle, warm breeze blow by. I lifted my head and looked at Joe's grave, asking, "Do you forgive me?" I posed the question like that. Then another warm breeze blew. It felt like Joe was answering me. That warm wind had a kindness to it that reminded me of how Joe used to speak. I said, "Thank you," and bowed my head deeply once more. "I promise, I'll absolutely keep this vow." I swore that to Joe. As I left, I turned towards Joe's grave one last time and said, "Joe, I'll be back." With that, I walked away. A decade has passed since then. We had just recently observed the 13th anniversary of Joe's passing. Margaret and I have been together ever since. living in a committed relationship, much like a common law marriage. On a day that came after that, Margaret suddenly said she had something important to discuss. It was on our way back from visiting Joe's grave to honor his memory. It had become our custom to pause and rest at a park before heading back home after these visits. That's when Margaret suddenly turned serious and started speaking. "Tom, it's been a while, and we just had Joe's 13th memorial service, so I've been thinking it's about time. I know we shouldn't rush to conclusions, but we need to think about our own lives too. I'm sorry for everything up to this point. Thanks for being there for me. So, here's this." In Margaret's trembling hand was a marriage license. I hugged Margaret tightly. "Don't apologize. I'm the one who said any form of us is fine, right?" Margaret broke into tears, nodded yes, and forced a smile. "Hey, don't cry. If you do, I'll feel like I've broken a man-to-man promise." I cheerfully said that to prevent Margaret from crying any further. Margaret laughed and said, "What's this man-to-man promise you were talking about?" "Well, never mind that." I hugged Margaret again and looked up at the sky. "Joe, I promise to keep my word to you." I'm sure Joe is watching over us, happy to see Margaret smiling. And so, we became a married couple. 2 years later, a new life was born into our family. A cute little girl who looks like Margaret. And on the day our child was born, there was a meteor shower. It was a special day for other reasons too. Joe loved stargazing. Both Margaret and I knew that. So we couldn't help but think that he was sending his blessings for a safe childbirth and our happiness. The child was safely born, full of energy. And she has since filled our lives with her adorable laughter. To ensure that the family we're committed to protecting can always smile. And while cherishing our loved ones as they deserve, we plan to keep living life in our own way. I'm a doctor. Is there anything I can help with? After finishing my usual work shift, I was heading home to my apartment in the city. Walking through a downtown shopping district, I noticed a crowd gathering. The smell of something burnt filled the air, and the red lights of ambulances and police cars illuminated the area. I knew right away it was an accident. I pushed through the onlookers to get to the police tape. I then identified myself to the paramedics, who were wearing white uniforms and helmets. "Vitals are stable," the paramedic informed me. Stable vitals in this context meant that the injured person's pulse, breathing, blood pressure, and body temperature were all normal. "Rescue is working on extraction. Thank you for your help." The young female paramedic energetically said this and gave me a quick salute. The crowd of onlookers kept coming. Some got bored and left, but even more people continued to arrive. I stood there, silently watching the rescue operations. Then, the young female paramedic came rushing over to me and asked for my contact information. I pulled my wallet out of my back pocket and gave her my business card from the medical clinic where I work. She compared the card and my face, looking back and forth between the two. Am I being suspected of something? Admittedly, at that time I was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, a pretty casual look. To anyone who saw me, I probably didn't look like a typical 28-year-old doctor. I wondered if they thought I was some sort of fake doctor, just goofing around. Within 10 minutes, a new ambulance arrived, and a doctor wearing a white coat with Disaster Medical Team written on the back got off the ambulance. The rescued patient was escorted into the ambulance by this doctor. I watched the ambulance speed off, then decided it was time for me to leave the scene. As I walked through the dispersing crowd, I noticed some people smirking as they looked at me. They were laughing and discussing whether or not I was a real doctor, even though I didn't do anything. I felt somewhat embarrassed, having impulsively offered my help as a doctor only to be superfluous in the end. Was I just another onlooker like everyone else who had gathered there? I had been employed at the current medical clinic for just under 2 years. I was a fledgling doctor with little experience. Yet, when I treated patients at the clinic, they called me Doc. Had that gone to my head? Is that why I had overstepped at the accident scene, announcing I was a doctor even though no one had asked? For a while after that, I kept questioning myself, almost to the point of absurdity. But as the days went by and work got busy, I started to forget about the whole thing. It was around that time, during my work hours, when the receptionist at the clinic forwarded an external call to me. "Yes, this is David." To my surprise, the call was from the female paramedic who I'd given my business card to at the accident scene. "Thank you, Dr. Jones, for your advice." "No problem. I hope I wasn't in the way." She went on to say that, as paramedics, they aren't doctors and can only perform limited medical procedures. So even during emergency activities, there's always a sense of unease. That's why, just having a doctor like you at the scene made us more at ease to do our jobs. Her words left me feeling a mixture of happiness and embarrassment, and I was somewhat at a loss. "I apologize for the late thank you. You were really a great help at that time. Thank you." With that, the call ended. Well, it's just polite talk, I guess. While I appreciated her thanks, I took her kind words lightly. Some weeks later, I was on the high-speed train to go to the general hospital where I was going to do my internship. While relaxing and reading a comic book I'd bought at the station's kiosk, an announcement came over the intercom. "Is there a doctor in here?" It was a medical emergency call. I looked up from my comic book. I looked around the train car, taking in the faces of the passengers. No one else stood up. At least in this car, there wasn't another doctor besides me. A sense of urgency ran through me. I gotta get moving. But at the same time, doubts flooded my mind. Could I actually handle this situation? Just then, the conductor hurriedly passed by in the aisle. No time for dilly-dallying. I steeled myself, preparing to stand up. But my legs felt weak and I couldn't rise. That's when it happened. "Thank you so much for your help back then." I remembered the voice of the paramedic who had called me after the accident. I had identified myself as a doctor, but couldn't actually do anything at the scene. Didn't I become a doctor to save lives? I gave myself a mental kick in the pants and finally stood up. I rushed after the conductor, moving through 2 or 3 cars. Once I caught up, I tapped him on the back. "Excuse me." The conductor turned towards me and asked what I needed. "I'm a doctor," I said. Hearing that, he respectfully stepped aside to show me a seat up ahead. There was a man in his 50s, stethoscope in hand, reassuring a patient. While I had hesitated, another doctor had answered the call. I felt relieved, but also ashamed of myself. I turned to head back to my seat, and as I stepped onto the deck, I felt a tap on my shoulder. What a crazy coincidence, Dr. Jones. The person who spoke was a young woman. I didn't know anyone around here, and she wasn't a patient I'd treated in my clinic either. I couldn't immediately place who she was. Dressed in a feminine dress, her hair flowing and glossy, her makeup natural but not overly done, and her skin clear and radiant, she caught my eye. May I ask who you are?" With that, the young woman stood at attention, brought her hand up to the side of her head, and saluted. "Ah, you're the paramedic from that time." Once I finally recognized her, she dropped her salute and beamed a radiant smile. While we were talking on the deck, the conductor from before passed by. She asked the conductor if she could move to the seat next to mine. Fortunately, the seat next to me was empty, and the conductor agreed. So, that's how we ended up sitting next to each other for the remainder of the trip. "Nice to meet you again. My name is Lori." "I'm David." I was reminded of college parties from my younger days. She was on vacation, heading back to her parents' home. She was 26, 2 years younger than me. She became a firefighter 7 years ago and had earned her paramedic license less than a year ago. I heard the medical emergency announcement earlier and rushed over to see if there was anything I could do. Turns out, another doctor had already arrived. She had been watching the situation unfold when I showed up, late to the scene. I recognized your voice as soon as you said, "I'm a doctor." Was it because it sounded dumb and awkward? When I said that in a self-deprecating way, she looked at me with puzzled eyes. Actually, I got really nervous with the emergency call. I confessed that I hesitated to identify myself as a doctor, which is why I didn't stand up immediately. She kept her eyes locked onto mine, without looking away. I felt the intensity of her gaze and lowered my face. Just then, a cart-pushing snack vendor walked by. I raised my hand to stop her and ordered 2 coffees. She held her cup of coffee in both hands and seemed to be searching for the right words to say. Sugar and milk. The silence was uncomfortable, so I broke it. But you did step up. You went to the patient and said, "I'm a doctor." Well, yes, that's true. Why'd you do it? You could have just ignored it. Her question made me think. I realized I could have ignored it. I did hesitate when I heard the emergency call, wondering if I should identify myself. But if I had decided to ignore it from the beginning, I wouldn't have had any doubts. Ultimately, it's my job as a doctor to save lives. That's why I became a doctor in the first place. When I said that, she nodded deeply without breaking her gaze ahead. Then she slowly turned to me, looking me straight in the eyes. Is something up? I felt flustered by the intensity of her gaze. That's wonderful. I had almost forgotten why I got into this line of work myself. My mind was in a whirl, but being called wonderful made me feel slightly embarrassed. Actually, it was the phone call you gave me that time that made me speak up. Thank you for that call. That call had given me the push I needed to identify myself as a doctor. Really, truly. Our faces naturally moved closer, locking eyes. I thought it was just a courtesy call when I received it. That wasn't the case, she said, looking slightly annoyed. But even during that accident, just like today, I wasn't much help. No, that's not true. Just having you there made a huge difference. I felt saved. Although she's a paramedic, her medical practice is limited compared to a doctor's. When things get out of hand, they have no choice but to rely on a physician. So, she said, just having a doctor like me at the scene provided enough reassurance to perform life-saving procedures. Is that how it is? That's exactly how it is. She then shared that she's going back home to discuss her future with her parents, who have been skeptical about her career in emergency services. However, her parents do acknowledge that being a paramedic is a meaningful and respectable job. But why do they insist that I shouldn't be doing this job? She asked. The work involves 24-hour shifts and is never easy. It's physically demanding and can sometimes be risky. Also, women only make up a small percentage of firefighters, including paramedics. It's still very much a man's world. It is probably a parent's desire to have her daughter have an easier job out of love for her. I can understand why your parents would be against it. Being a paramedic is tough. You think so too, doctor? She turned away as if pouting. I found her reaction irresistibly cute. An announcement over the intercom said that we were approaching the final stop. We both took down our bags from the overhead bin and started preparing to get off the train. Then, something crossed my mind. So, I decided to ask her. Did I give you my business card at the accident site? She nodded, yes. I asked her why she kept comparing my face to the business card back then. Did you think I was some kind of fake doctor?" Then she waved her hand sideways in front of me, saying no. It turned out that she lived very close to my clinic and had walked past it nearly every day. She was surprised to see that I was the doctor who worked there. After that, we both got off the train and walked together to the ticket gates. "Doctor, thanks for spending time with me today." "Not at all. What are you talking about?" As I looked puzzled, she continued. She had been wrestling with how to convince her parents to accept her choice of becoming a paramedic. Talking to me during that train ride on the Amtrak helped her clarify her thoughts. "I'll tell them. I don't want to leave emergency work to someone else. It's not about why should I do it, it's I can do it because it's me. That's what I'm going to say." With that, she gave me a warm smile and strode away with confidence. Weeks passed since that day. We hadn't met or even communicated with her since then. But then, during my lunch break that day, I decided to check out a new restaurant across the station from my clinic that the staff had been raving about. Walking back, lost in thoughts about the afternoon schedule, I saw a woman in a tracksuit standing in front of a vending machine. I figured she was probably just indecisive about what to buy and walked on by. But then, Dr. Jones, it was her who had called out. She was radiant, even in her jogging outfit, just as she was when I saw her on the train. "Wow, it's you, Lori. What a surprise." She was off that day and had been out jogging. She said she'd been thirsty and was looking to grab something from the vending machine, but all they had were sugary drinks, so she was undecided. As I headed back to my clinic, she decided to tag along. She gave up on the vending machine and picked up some seltzer water from a convenience store on the way. "Speaking of which, did your parents give their approval?" Taking a sip of her freshly bought seltzer water, she answered. "Yeah, I managed to convince them." I felt proud of her for saying that with such confidence. "What do you think about female paramedics, Doc?" Caught off guard by her sudden question, I hesitated to answer. "Well, it's a meaningful and respectable job, regardless of gender." As I was saying this, she interrupted me. "I'm not talking about in general, I mean, what do you think about someone like me, a female paramedic?" "Well, being female doesn't really change anything." She took my hand, which was visibly confused. And she said, "You know, this is the third time we've randomly run into each other. Maybe it's not so random after all." From then on, we started to meet up whenever we could find a spare moment in our busy schedules. On a rare evening when both of us were off. "How about one more glass of wine?" I asked her at a restaurant across from the station. "Sounds good. One more glass. We're a doctor and a paramedic, but it's not a crime to let loose once in a while, right?" She said that, but before ordering another glass of wine, she started to feel tipsy and seemed like she was about to become unsteady. "This isn't good." I raised my hand to signal the waiter to hold off on further orders. Then she snapped back to reality and asked, "What about the wine, Doc?" "Doctor's orders. No more for tonight. You're already sleepy, aren't you?" She gave a slight nod and looked up at me. Her eyes slightly unfocused due to both sleepiness and wine. I found her incredibly endearing. After leaving the restaurant, we took a long walk to sober up. Suddenly, we heard a loud crashing sound coming from down the road. What was that? An accident? What do you think that noise was? Both of us switched into emergency mode in an instant. Most of the alcohol had already worn off, and anyway, we could clearly state that we had been drinking if necessary. When you can't be of use, then you can't be of use. But now was not that time. We had to get there as fast as possible. We looked at each other, nodded, tightly held hands, and dashed toward the source of the noise. "I'm a doctor. I'm a paramedic. So, how did you find today's story?" Hitting the like and subscribe buttons really encourages us to keep creating. We're also looking forward to hearing your comments. See you in the next video.